When Electra first begins to see Dylan not as a nuisance or an inconvenience, but as an existential threat, the shift inside her is almost imperceptible, a quiet tightening rather than an explosion. It is not jealousy alone that drives this transformation, though jealousy certainly sharpens its edges. It is fear of loss, fear of being replaced, fear that the life she has painstakingly assembled with Will could be undone by a woman who insists on appearing harmless. Electra has always trusted her instincts, and now those instincts are whispering the same warning over and over again. Dylan is not what she pretends to be. The danger lies not in overt aggression, but in subtlety, in the way Dylan smiles too easily, retreats too quickly, and performs innocence with just enough precision to feel rehearsed. The more Dylan insists she wants nothing, the more Electra becomes convinced that Dylan wants everything. It is this conviction that becomes the foundation of Electra's private war, a war she wages not with confrontation, but with calculation. She understands that power does not always come from being loud. Sometimes it comes from being thorough. Electra does not announce her suspicions, at least not at first. Instead, she begins to observe. She revisits old conversations, re-examines casual remarks, replays moments she once dismissed as insignificant. Every coincidence now feels weighted with intent. Every overlap between Dylan's presence and moments of tension in her relationship with Will becomes a thread worth pulling. What starts as vigilance evolves into strategy, and soon Electra is no longer simply reacting to perceived threats, she is actively constructing a hunt. The hunt is methodical. Electra gathers fragments of information, the way others might collect souvenirs, careful not to reveal her purpose. She speaks to people who have crossed paths with Dylan, framing her questions as concern rather than suspicion. She listens more than she talks, letting silences do the work of persuasion. When someone hesitates, she leans in gently, offering validation, creating the sense that they are uncovering something together. Bit by bit, she builds a narrative in which Dylan is not merely an ex-lover or a lingering shadow, but a destabilizing force, someone whose presence threatens the equilibrium of everyone around her. Electra does not need proof yet. She needs alignment. She needs people to see Dylan through her eyes. As the circle widens, pressure becomes her most effective weapon. Electra understands human weakness intimately, especially her own, and she exploits that understanding with ruthless efficiency. She knows which insecurities to press, which loyalties to question. With Will, the pressure is emotional, layered beneath everyday conversations. She speaks of trust, of transparency, of how fragile their happiness could be if old ghosts are allowed too much space. She never explicitly demands that he choose, but the implication lingers, heavy and unavoidable. With others, the pressure takes different forms: concern for safety, appeals to morality, hints of consequences should the truth remain buried. Each interaction tightens the net around Dylan, even as Dylan remains unaware of how thoroughly she is being encircled. Ironically, Dylan's response only deepens Electra's certainty. Faced with subtle hostility and shifting dynamics, Dylan retreats, adopting an even more careful version of herself. She softens her voice, minimizes her presence, avoids conflict at all costs. To Dylan, this feels like self-preservation, a way to demonstrate that she poses no threat, that she has no intention of reclaiming Will or disrupting his life. But to Electra, this restraint reads as performance. Innocence, she believes, should be effortless. Dylan's carefulness feels deliberate, calculated. Every attempt to appear harmless becomes, in Electra's mind, further evidence of concealment. The quieter Dylan becomes, the louder Electra's suspicions grow. This psychological dynamic, one woman retreating while the other advances, creates a fatal imbalance. Electra begins to experience her fear as urgency. The idea that Dylan might eventually succeed, not through overt action but through patience and proximity, becomes unbearable. Electra imagines futures in which Dylan's quiet persistence wears Will down, where old feelings resurface not because Dylan forces them, but because she allows them space to breathe. The threat, in Electra's mind, is not dramatic betrayal, but erosion. And erosion, she knows, can destroy even the strongest foundations if left unchecked. At some point, the hunt crosses a line, though it is difficult to identify exactly when. Perhaps it happens the first time Electra allows herself to think of Dylan's removal as a solution rather than a fantasy. Or perhaps it occurs gradually, through repetition, as the idea becomes familiar enough to lose its shock. What is clear is that Electra's internal narrative shifts from defense to offense. She no longer asks herself how to protect her relationship with Will. She asks how to eliminate the risk entirely. In this logic, Dylan's continued existence becomes synonymous with inevitable loss. To save her future, Electra convinces herself she must be willing to do something unforgivable. This conviction hardens into resolve when Electra reaches a moment of absolute clarity, at least as she perceives it. Something small triggers it, a look exchanged between Will and Dylan, a tone of voice, a shared memory resurfacing at the wrong time. To an outside observer, the moment might seem insignificant, even imaginary. But to Electra, it is confirmation. The hunt has yielded its conclusion. Dylan will never truly disappear on her own. Waiting, hoping, trusting in restraint will only give Dylan time. If Electra hesitates now, she believes she will lose Will not with a bang, but with a quiet, devastating inevitability. The decision to kill Dylan is not born of rage in the traditional sense. It is colder than that, shaped by a warped sense of necessity. Electra frames the act not as violence, but as prevention. In her mind, she is choosing the lesser evil, sacrificing one life to preserve another, her own emotional survival, her future with Will, the stability she believes Dylan threatens to dismantle. This moral distortion is what makes the decision so terrifyingly firm. Electra does not see herself as a murderer. She sees herself as a guardian, someone forced into darkness by circumstances beyond her control. Yet Electra also understands that she cannot act alone. The hunt has taught her the value of leverage, of shared culpability. This is where Remy enters the story, not as a mastermind, but as an accelerant. Remy's motivations are complex, tangled in loyalty, resentment, and a desire to matter. He listens to Electra's version of events, absorbing her fears and certainties until they begin to feel like his own. Whether he fully believes Dylan deserves to die is almost irrelevant. What matters is that he believes Electra believes it, and that belief becomes justification enough. Together, they construct a plan that relies not on chaos, but on shock, something sudden and irreversible that will send ripples through the town before anyone has time to question the narrative. Dylan's death, when it comes, is both abrupt and symbolic. There is no drawn-out confrontation, no opportunity for final words or confessions. The violence is swift, designed to leave no space for ambiguity about the outcome. In its aftermath, the town is plunged into a different kind of horror, one that feels heavier because it contradicts everything people thought they knew. Dylan, once positioned as a threat, becomes a victim. Her death destabilizes the fragile consensus that had formed around her supposed guilt, replacing certainty with confusion and dread. If Dylan was truly dangerous, why does her death feel so wrong? And if she was innocent, what does that say about the people who wanted her gone? The shock spreads quickly, infecting every corner of the town. Conversations fracture into whispers, speculation, and accusation. Electra's role in shaping the narrative becomes both more powerful and more precarious. On the surface, she grieves, performing the expected rituals of shock and sorrow. Beneath that performance, however, she is fighting a different battle, one against exposure, against the creeping realization that violence does not end fear, but multiplies it. The hunt may be over, but its consequences are only beginning to unfold. Internally, Electra is haunted by contradictions she cannot resolve. She tells herself that she has saved her relationship, yet Will's grief creates a distance she cannot bridge. She tells herself that Dylan was a threat, yet the silence Dylan leaves behind feels accusatory rather than relieving. Every reminder of Dylan, a place she once stood, a conversation she never finished, becomes a fissure in Electra's certainty. The very act meant to secure her future begins to erode her sense of self. She is no longer simply protecting what she loves. She is defending a lie she must now live inside. Remy, too, begins to feel the weight of what they have done, though his response takes a different shape. The adrenaline fades, replaced by paranoia. He watches people more closely, listens for hints of suspicion in casual remarks. The town's shock, rather than providing cover, heightens his anxiety. Every question about Dylan's death feels like a threat. Every attempt to memorialize her feels like a judgment. The shared secret between him and Electra becomes a bond that isolates them both, trapping them in a private reality, increasingly at odds with the world around them. As the town reels, the narrative fractures once more. Dylan's death does not close the story, it reopens it in a more dangerous form. If she was killed to prevent something, the question becomes unavoidable. What was she truly capable of? Or more importantly, what did others believe she was capable of? The hunt that Electra initiated now turns inward, reflected back onto those who shaped it. Suspicion no longer has a single target. It spreads, searching for motive, opportunity, and complicity. The shock of Dylan's death becomes a catalyst, forcing the town to confront the uncomfortable reality that fear, when left unchecked, can transform protectors into predators. In the end, the tragedy lies not only in Dylan's death, but in the chain of decisions that made it feel inevitable to someone like Electra. The story exposes how easily self-preservation can become justification, how quickly perception can harden into conviction, and how violence often masquerades as necessity when fear is allowed to rule unchecked. Dylan tried to disappear to survive, while Electra chose to destroy to feel safe. Between those two impulses, a life was lost and a town was forever altered, left to reckon with the devastating cost of a hunt that should never have begun. The town does not return to normal after Dylan's death. It pretends to, at first. Shops reopen on schedule, routines resume, people greet one another with practiced familiarity. But beneath that surface, there is a low, constant hum of unease, like a machine left running in an empty room. Dylan's killing does not feel like an ending. It feels like an interruption, as if the story has been cut mid-sentence and everyone is waiting for the rest of the words to arrive. Grief for Dylan is complicated and uneven, tangled with guilt and revision. Some remember her as the woman they were told to fear. Others begin, slowly and painfully, to remember her as someone who tried very hard not to be seen at all. That contradiction becomes the first crack in the narrative Electra worked so carefully to build. Will is the epicenter of that crack. His grief is not explosive, it is corrosive. It eats away at him quietly, altering the shape of his thoughts, eroding the assumptions he once held without question. Dylan's death does not bring him relief, as Electra had promised herself it would. Instead, it brings a silence that feels wrong, to heavy, to final. He finds himself replaying old interactions with Dylan, searching for signs of the danger Electra had insisted was there. The more he looks, the less certain he becomes. Dylan's restraint, once framed as manipulation, now reads differently in the absence of her voice. It feels less like strategy and more like exhaustion. Electra senses this shift long before Will names it. She feels it in the pauses between his words, in the way his eyes linger on spaces Dylan once occupied. What she had imagined as safety now feels like distance. She tells herself this is temporary, that grief has stages, that eventually Will remember why Dylan frightened them both. But doubt has a way of infiltrating even the most carefully defended beliefs. At night, when Electra is alone, the certainty that once fueled her begins to falter. She replays the logic that led her to the hunt, repeating it like a mantra, but each repetition feels thinner, less convincing. The investigation into Dylan's death becomes the external manifestation of Electra's internal unraveling. What begins as a straightforward inquiry soon reveals inconsistencies that refuse to stay quiet. Timelines do not align as neatly as expected. Witness accounts diverge in subtle but significant ways. Someone mentions seeing Dylan earlier than reported. Someone else recalls Remy nearby at a moment that should have been insignificant. None of these details are damning on their own, but together they form a pattern that suggests intention rather than accident, coordination rather than chaos. Remy feels the pressure first. Unlike Electra, he does not have the same emotional armor. His role in Dylan's death, initially rationalized as assistance, begins to weigh on him with increasing intensity. He notices how often his name comes up in casual conversation, how people's questions linger just a beat too long. The town's shock has sharpened its curiosity, and curiosity is dangerous. Remy starts to pull away, limiting his interactions, avoiding places where he might be seen too often. His isolation, meant to protect him, only deepens his paranoia. Electra, watching Remy retreat, feels a flicker of resentment she quickly suppresses. She tells herself she is stronger, more disciplined. She has always been better at maintaining appearances. Yet even she cannot fully escape the sense that control is slipping through her fingers. The hunt she once orchestrated with such precision now seems to have turned inward, redirecting its focus toward the architects rather than the target. The town does not yet know what questions to ask, but it is learning how to listen. Will's growing unease becomes impossible to ignore when he begins to ask questions of his own. Not accusations, not at first, but clarifications. He asks Electra about specific moments, about things she said during the hunt, about why she was so certain Dylan posed a threat. Each question lands like a test, and Electra feels herself tightening in response. She answers carefully, choosing words that reinforce the old narrative, but the ease with which she once did so is gone. Will hears the strain beneath her explanations, the effort it takes to maintain coherence. At the same time, memories surface that Will cannot easily reconcile with Electra's certainty. He recalls Dylan backing away from conflict, her refusal to engage when provoked. He remembers moments when she seemed less dangerous than desperate, less manipulative than lost. These memories do not absolve Dylan of everything Electra accused her of, but they complicate the story enough to unsettle him. He begins to wonder whether fear, rather than fact, drove Electra's conclusions. Electra senses this internal shift and responds the only way she knows how, by doubling down. She reinforces her version of events, reminding Will of how threatened she felt, how close she believed she was to losing him. She frames her actions as protective, born of love and necessity. In doing so, she reveals something she does not intend to, that her fear was not abstract, but deeply personal, rooted in a belief that her worth depended on holding on to Will at any cost. This admission, subtle as it is, changes the way Will sees her. Love, he realizes, has been weaponized, turned into justification. Meanwhile, the town's attention begins to pivot. Dylan's death, initially absorbed as a tragic shock, becomes a focal point for broader anxieties. People start to talk about how easily narratives can be constructed, how quickly suspicion can harden into conviction. Dylan's name, once synonymous with threat, now carries an undercurrent of sympathy. Memorials appear quietly, without fanfare, small gestures of acknowledgement that feel almost rebellious in their refusal to accept the original story at face value. These gestures do not go unnoticed. Electra feels them like pinpricks, each one a reminder that the town's loyalty is no longer assured. The social alignment she worked so hard to build begins to fracture as people reconsider their positions. Some withdraw entirely, unwilling to take sides. Others begin to distance themselves from Electra, sensing that proximity now carries risk. Power, Electra learns, is fragile when it depends on belief rather than truth. Remy reaches his breaking point when investigators approach him directly. The questions are polite, procedural, but their implications are unmistakable. He realizes that his role, once minimized in his own mind, is now a liability. The shared secret he and Electra carry no longer feels like protection, it feels like a trap. In moments of panic, he considers confessing, not out of remorse alone, but out of desperation. He wants the weight off his chest, wants the constant vigilance to end. Electra, sensing Remy's instability, attempts to reassert control. She reminds him of their shared responsibility, of the consequences that would follow if the truth emerged. Her tone is firm, almost cold, a stark contrast to the urgency that once bonded them. This shift does not reassure Remy, it alienates him further. He begins to see Electra not as a partner in necessity, but as the architect of his fear. The realization that he may have been used becomes impossible to ignore. Will's internal conflict reaches a turning point when he confronts the possibility that Dylan was killed not to protect him, but to secure Electra's version of the future. This realization does not arrive all at once. It creeps in through observation, through the accumulation of small inconsistencies. He notices how Electra avoids certain topics, how her grief seems rehearsed, how her anger surfaces most intensely when her narrative is challenged. Love, he realizes, does not require this level of control. The emotional distance between them becomes palpable. Conversations grow shorter, more cautious. Electra feels the loss acutely, recognizing too late that the act meant to preserve her relationship has instead poisoned it. She tells herself that this, too, is temporary, that once the investigation concludes, once the town settles, Will come back to her. But the foundation has shifted. Trust, once fractured, does not rebuild easily. As the investigation deepens, the truth begins to press against the edges of public awareness. No single revelation exposes everything, but the accumulation of doubt becomes impossible to contain. Rumors circulate, not as accusations, but as questions. Why was Dylan's death so sudden? Why did certain people seem prepared for it? Why does Electra react so strongly to any suggestion that Dylan might not have been the threat she claimed? Electra's internal monologue grows, increasingly defensive. She reasserts her original logic, reminding herself of the fear that drove her, of the certainty she once felt. But logic cannot silence guilt, and guilt has begun to seep into her dreams, manifesting as fragmented images and unresolved confrontations. Dylan appears not as an enemy, but as a question Electra cannot answer. The hunt, once external, has become internal, turning Electra's own mind into a battlefield. The town stands on the brink of a reckoning, though no one can yet name what form it will take. Dylan's death has destabilized the social order, exposing how easily fear can be mobilized, how quickly justice can be replaced by narrative convenience. Whether the full truth will emerge remains uncertain. What is clear is that the consequences of the hunt cannot be undone. A life has been taken, trust has been shattered, and the illusion of moral clarity has been irreversibly broken. In the end, the story does not move toward resolution so much as it expands, revealing layers of responsibility and motive that resist simplification. Electra, once convinced she was protecting everything she loved, is forced to confront the possibility that she destroyed it instead. Remy, trapped between loyalty and survival, faces a choice that will define him as much as the one he already made. Will, caught between grief and awakening, must decide whether love built on fear can ever be repaired. And the town, watching all of this unfold, learns a devastating lesson. That hunts, once unleashed, do not end when the target falls. They linger, reshaping everyone involved, turning certainty into suspicion and safety into a fragile, contested space. Dylan's absence becomes a presence in itself, a reminder that fear, when allowed to dictate action, can transform ordinary people into architects of irreversible harm.